The grandfather clock in the foyer struck 11:30 as David Harrison pushed through the heavy oak doors of his estate, his expensive leather briefcase hitting the marble floor with a dull thud. The sound echoed through the cavernous entrance hall, bouncing off walls lined with oil paintings worth more than most people's homes. His tie hung loose around his neck, and dark circles shadowed his eyes after another grueling day at Harrison Industries, where million-dollar decisions were made before most people finished their morning coffee. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The house stood silent around him, its vastness seeming to swallow every sound. Somewhere in the depths of the mansion, he could hear the faint hum of the central air system pushing cool air through rooms that rarely saw visitors. The crystal chandelier above cast fractured light across the polished floor, creating patterns that danced and shifted as he moved beneath it. This was his kingdom, his fortress of success, built from decades of ruthless business deals and calculated risks that had paid off beyond his wildest dreams. Yet tonight, something felt different. An unease settled in his chest as he loosened his tie completely and let it fall to the floor. His housekeeper would pick it up in the morning, along with whatever else he left scattered in his wake. That was how things worked in his world. Someone else always cleaned up the mess. David had built his empire from nothing, starting with a small construction company inherited from his father and turning it into a multinational corporation that employed thousands. His name appeared on Forbes lists, his face graced magazine covers, and his opinions moved stock prices. He owned properties in 7 countries, a yacht that could house 50 people, and cars that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Success had been his religion, and money his altar. But success came with a price he had never bothered to calculate. His wife Sarah had left him 3 years ago, taking half his assets but leaving behind their 2 children, 16-year-old Marcus and 14-year-old Sophia. The divorce settlement had barely made a dent in his fortune, but losing his children's respect had cost him something he couldn't quantify. They lived in his house, ate his food, and spent his money, but they were strangers wearing his last name. The silence felt oppressive as he climbed the curved staircase, his hands sliding along the mahogany banister that had been carved by craftsmen whose work now decorated museums. Family portraits lined the stairway wall, images of happier times when his family still smiled genuine smiles instead of the forced expressions they wore during their rare public appearances together. Those photos seemed to mock him now, reminders of relationships he had sacrificed on the altar of ambition. His children had learned to navigate the world with the casual cruelty that often came with unlimited privilege. They attended the most exclusive private schools, wore designer clothes like uniforms, and treated service workers as if they were invisible furniture. David had noticed their behavior, had even felt occasional pangs of concern, but business always demanded his attention elsewhere. There were mergers to complete, competitors to outmaneuver, and profits to maximize. He had convinced himself that providing for them financially was the same as being a good father. As he reached the second-floor landing, David paused outside Marcus's room, hearing the familiar sounds of video games and loud music bleeding through the walls. His son spent most evenings locked away with his gaming systems and expensive electronics, emerging only for meals or to demand money for some new extravagance. Their conversations rarely extended beyond David asking about grades and Marcus responding with monosyllabic answers delivered without looking up from whatever screen commanded his attention. Sophia's room lay at the end of the hall, equally isolated behind a door decorated with posters of celebrities and fashion models. She had inherited her mother's beauty but combined it with a cold indifference that sometimes startled David with its intensity. At 14, she already possessed the calculating gaze of someone who had learned early that money could solve most problems and create others. Her allowance exceeded what many adults earned, yet she always seemed to want more, as if no amount of material possession could fill whatever emptiness drove her constant demands. The 3rd floor of the mansion housed the staff quarters, a series of modest but comfortable rooms where his employees lived during their tenure. David rarely ventured there, leaving the management of household affairs to his assistant while he focused on matters he considered more important. The people who cooked his meals, cleaned his home, and maintained his lifestyle were largely invisible to him, existing at the periphery of his consciousness like background noise he had learned to ignore. Rosa Martinez had worked for the Harrison family for almost 5 years, arriving each morning before dawn to begin her duties and staying until well after sunset to ensure everything met David's exacting standards. She was a quiet woman in her late 40s, small in stature but possessing the kind of steady competence that made complicated households function smoothly. Her English carried traces of her native Guatemala, and she moved through the mansion with the careful efficiency of someone who understood that her livelihood depended on remaining unnoticed while being indispensable. David knew very little about Rosa beyond her work performance, which had always been exemplary. She prepared meals that accommodated his dietary preferences, maintained his schedule with meticulous attention to detail, and somehow managed to keep his children's increasingly chaotic lives organized despite their complete lack of cooperation. When he thought of her at all, it was usually in the context of household logistics or the occasional reminder that her salary needed processing through payroll. The irony was not lost on him that Rosa probably understood his family's daily rhythms better than he did. She witnessed Marcus's tantrums when his credit card reached its limit, observed Sophia's casual cruelty toward delivery workers and service staff, and navigated the constant tension that permeated the house like smoke from a fire no one acknowledged. She had become the invisible witness to their family's slow dissolution, cleaning up messes that extended far beyond spilled drinks or scattered belongings. Tonight, as David finally reached his master bedroom suite, he felt the familiar weight of isolation settling over him like a heavy blanket. The room was larger than most people's entire apartments, featuring a sitting area, walk-in closets that could house small businesses, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the city below. Yet it felt more like a luxurious prison than a sanctuary, decorated with expensive furniture that had been selected by an interior designer rather than chosen with any personal attachment. He had everything money could buy and nothing that money couldn't replace. His relationships had become transactions, his family had become strangers, and his success had become a golden cage that grew smaller each year despite its expanding boundaries. The mansion that should have represented the pinnacle of achievement instead felt like a monument to everything he had lost while pursuing everything he thought he wanted. As David prepared for bed, removing his Rolex and placing it on the bedside table next to his phone, he caught his reflection in the mirror across the room. The man staring back at him looked older than his 52 years, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of stress rather than laughter. He had won the game of capitalism but somehow felt like he had lost something more valuable in the process, though he couldn't quite name what that something was. The house settled around him as he turned off the lights, the sounds of his children's activities gradually fading as they too prepared for sleep. Somewhere below, Rosa would be completing her final tasks of the day, ensuring that tomorrow would begin as smoothly as today had ended. She was probably the only person in the household who truly understood how all the pieces fit together, the only one who saw the complete picture of their daily existence rather than just her own small piece of it. Sleep came fitfully for David that night, interrupted by dreams he couldn't quite remember upon waking but that left him feeling unsettled and restless. He found himself thinking about choices he had made, relationships he had neglected, and the growing distance between who he had become and who he had once imagined himself to be. The success that had once felt like validation now seemed more like compensation for losses he had never properly acknowledged. Morning arrived with the same mechanical precision that governed every day in the Harrison household. David's alarm sounded at exactly 6 o'clock, followed by the arrival of his coffee and newspaper, delivered to his bedside table by Rosa with the same quiet efficiency that characterized all her interactions. She moved through his room like a ghost, straightening items that didn't need straightening and ensuring that his day would begin exactly as he expected it to begin. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison," she said softly, her voice carrying the careful politeness of someone who had learned to navigate the moods of wealthy employers. "Your breakfast will be ready in 20 minutes. Marcus has already left for school, but Sophia is still getting ready. She asked me to tell you that she needs additional money for her shopping trip with friends this afternoon." David nodded without really listening, his attention already shifting to the business news scrolling across his phone screen. Stock futures were up, which meant his portfolio had likely gained another few $1 million overnight while he slept. The numbers that had once excited him now barely registered, just another day in a life where wealth accumulated faster than he could spend it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He barely noticed Rosa's departure, her presence so seamlessly integrated into his routine that she might as well have been part of the furniture. The morning progressed with the same predictable rhythm that had governed David's life for years. His driver waited outside at precisely 7:15 to transport him to the office, where a full schedule of meetings and conference calls awaited his attention. His assistant had already prioritized his correspondence, his lawyers had prepared briefs for his review, and his financial advisors had updated projections that would guide investment decisions worth millions of dollars. Yet as David's limousine pulled away from the estate, he found himself looking back at the mansion with an unusual sense of detachment, as if seeing it through someone else's eyes rather than his own. The building stood like a fortress against the morning sky, its windows reflecting sunlight that seemed to emphasize its isolation rather than its grandeur. Somewhere inside those walls, Rosa was beginning her daily routine of maintaining a household that functioned like a well-oiled machine despite the dysfunction of the family it served. The business day unfolded with the same relentless pace that had defined David's career for decades. He reviewed quarterly reports that showed continued growth across all divisions, approved expansion plans that would extend his company's reach into new markets, and negotiated deals that would add millions to his already substantial wealth. His decisions affected thousands of employees, influenced entire industries, and moved financial markets in measurable ways. But throughout the day, David found his concentration periodically interrupted by thoughts that had nothing to do with profit margins or market share. He would catch himself wondering about the people who worked in his home, about their lives and concerns and dreams that existed completely separate from his own ambitions. It was an unusual preoccupation for someone who had spent decades training himself to focus exclusively on matters that directly affected his bottom line. During his lunch meeting with potential investors, David realized he was only half listening to their presentation about a new development project in Southeast Asia. Instead, he was thinking about Rosa's quiet efficiency, about how she somehow managed to anticipate needs he didn't even know he had, about the fact that he knew almost nothing about her life beyond her work performance. The investors interpreted his distraction as careful consideration of their proposal, but David was actually questioning assumptions he had never bothered to examine before. The afternoon brought a conference call with his international holdings, where executives from London, Tokyo, and Sydney reported on operations that generated revenue streams most people couldn't comprehend. David participated with the same sharp focus that had built his empire, asking pointed questions and making strategic decisions that would ripple through markets around the world. Yet even as he engaged with these global concerns, part of his mind remained oddly focused on the domestic sphere he had always taken for granted. Marcus and Sophia were typically absent from David's thoughts during business hours, their lives running on parallel tracks that rarely intersected with his professional responsibilities. He provided for them financially with the same systematic approach he applied to all his investments, ensuring they had access to the best schools, the finest clothes, and unlimited spending money to support whatever lifestyle they chose to pursue. Their emotional needs had always seemed secondary to their material requirements, a calculation that had seemed logical when his own time was so valuable and limited. But today, for reasons he couldn't entirely explain, David found himself wondering about his children's daily experiences, about how they interacted with the world beyond their privileged bubble, about what kind of people they were becoming under the influence of unlimited resources and minimal oversight. The thought troubled him in ways he wasn't prepared to examine too closely, suggesting questions about his parenting that he had always avoided asking himself. The executive team meeting that concluded his business day focused on fourth-quarter projections and strategic planning for the following year. David listened to presentations about market opportunities, competitive threats, and resource allocation with the same analytical mindset that had driven his success for decades. His companies were performing beyond expectations, his personal wealth continued to grow at unprecedented rates, and his reputation as a business leader remained unassailable among his peers. Yet as the meeting ended and David prepared for his evening commute, he felt none of the satisfaction that such positive news should have generated. The numbers that had once provided clear validation of his worth now seemed increasingly abstract, disconnected from any meaningful sense of accomplishment or purpose. He had won every game that mattered in his professional life, but the victories felt increasingly hollow, like trophies awarded for competitions he was no longer sure were worth winning. The drive home through evening traffic gave David unwanted time to reflect on patterns he had never questioned before. His limousine moved through streets lined with restaurants where families shared meals together, parks where parents played with their children, and neighborhoods where people seemed to find fulfillment in simple daily interactions. Through his tinted windows, he observed a world of connections and relationships that existed completely outside his experience, a parallel universe where success was measured by different standards than profit margins and market share. His phone buzzed continuously throughout the journey, bringing updates from his various business interests and requests for decisions that could wait until tomorrow but somehow always seemed urgent in the moment. David responded to each message with the same efficiency he applied to all aspects of his professional life, but he noticed that the constant demands for his attention were preventing him from engaging with thoughts and feelings that seemed increasingly important to address. As the limousine turned through the gates of his estate, David felt the familiar transition from public figure to private individual, though the distinction had become increasingly meaningless over the years. His identity had become so thoroughly merged with his business persona that he sometimes wondered if there was anything left of the man he had been before success had consumed every other aspect of his existence. The mansion that came into view represented the pinnacle of material achievement, yet it felt more like a symbol of isolation than triumph. The front door opened as his car pulled into the circular driveway, with Rosa appearing to take his briefcase and coat in the same seamless manner that characterized all her interactions. She moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood that her employer's comfort depended on eliminating any friction from his daily routine, anticipating needs before they were expressed and solving problems before they became inconveniences. "Good evening, Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice carrying the same careful politeness that never varied regardless of circumstances. "Dinner is ready whenever you're prepared to eat. Marcus is upstairs doing homework, and Sophia is at her friend's house. She called to say she'll be home before 10 o'clock. David nodded absently, his attention already shifting to the evening routine that would carry him through the remaining hours before sleep. Yet something in Rosa's demeanor caught his notice, a subtle tension around her eyes that suggested concerns she would never express directly. For the first time in years, he found himself actually looking at her rather than simply acknowledging her presence, seeing her as an individual rather than a function in his household's operation. She was smaller than he had remembered, with graying hair pulled back in the same practical style she had worn for as long as he could recall. Her face carried the lines of someone who had worked hard for everything she possessed, but her expression remained carefully neutral in the way of professional service workers who had learned to hide their personal thoughts behind polite efficiency. There was something in her eyes, though, a weariness that went beyond simple fatigue and suggested burdens he had never bothered to consider. "Rosa," David said, surprising himself by actually addressing her directly rather than simply accepting her report and moving on. "Is everything all right? You seem..." He paused, struggling to articulate observations he wasn't accustomed to making. "You seem troubled." Her reaction was immediate and carefully controlled, the brief flash of surprise in her eyes quickly replaced by the professional mask she wore during all their interactions. "Everything is fine, Mr. Harrison. Thank you for asking. Is there anything special you need this evening?" The response was perfect in its deflection, neither confirming nor denying his observation while redirecting attention back to his needs rather than her own concerns. It was exactly the kind of interaction David had come to expect from his staff, professional and efficient while maintaining appropriate boundaries between employer and employee. Yet tonight, for the first time, he found himself wishing for something more honest, more human, more real than the careful politeness that governed all their exchanges. "No, nothing special," David replied, but he continued to study her face, looking for clues to whatever was troubling her. "The children haven't been giving you any problems, have they? I know they can be challenging sometimes." Rosa's expression remained carefully neutral, but David thought he detected the slightest tightening around her eyes, a reaction so subtle he might have missed it entirely if he hadn't been paying unusual attention. The children are fine, Mr. Harrison. They're just young, that's all. Young people sometimes act without thinking about how their actions affect others. The diplomatic phrasing was masterful in its avoidance of any direct criticism while still managing to convey information David wasn't sure he wanted to hear. His children's behavior towards staff had never been a major concern for him, falling into the category of household management issues that he preferred to delegate rather than address personally. But something in Rose's carefully chosen words suggested problems that might require more attention than he had been giving them. "What exactly do you mean by that?" David asked, his business instincts engaged by the subtle warning embedded in her response. "Have Marcus or Sophia been treating you inappropriately?" The question hung in the air between them, carrying implications that neither was fully prepared to address. David realized he was venturing into territory he had never explored before, asking about relationships and dynamics in his own household that he had always assumed were functioning smoothly because no one had ever complained directly to him. Rose's hesitation suggested that his assumptions might have been built on foundations less solid than he had imagined. "They're good children, Mr. Harrison," Rosa said finally, her words chosen with the care of someone navigating a minefield. "They just sometimes forget that other people have feelings too. It's not uncommon for young people from privileged backgrounds to need reminding about treating others with respect." The phrase "privileged backgrounds" carried more weight than David was comfortable examining, suggesting perspectives on his family's lifestyle that he had never considered before. His children had grown up with advantages he had worked his entire life to provide, but Rose's gentle observation implied that those advantages might have come with costs he hadn't calculated. The idea that Marcus and Sophia might be lacking in basic empathy or consideration for others challenged assumptions about parenting that he had never questioned before. "Have they been disrespectful to you specifically?" David pressed, his protective instincts warring with a growing suspicion that he might not want to hear the answer. "I want you to be honest with me, Rosa. If there's a problem, I need to know about it." Rosa's pause extended long enough to become uncomfortable, her careful composure wavering slightly as she weighed her response. David could see her internal struggle between professional discretion and what appeared to be genuine distress, a conflict that suggested issues more serious than simple teenage rudeness. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a tremor that penetrated the professional distance she usually maintained. "Mr. Harrison, I don't want to cause any problems or make trouble for anyone," she began, her words coming slowly as if each one required careful consideration. "Your children are not bad people. They don't understand how their words and actions affect others who aren't in their position. Sometimes young people need time to learn that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of their job or social status." The diplomatic language couldn't entirely disguise the pain underlying her words, and David felt something shift in his chest, an uncomfortable recognition that his household might be harboring problems he had never bothered to investigate. His success in business had been built on gathering accurate information and addressing problems before they became crises, yet he had apparently been operating blind to significant issues in his own home. "Rosa, I want you to tell me exactly what's been happening," David said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used in business negotiations. "I can't address problems I don't know about, and I need to understand what's been going on under my own roof." The shift in his demeanor seemed to give Rosa permission to speak more freely, though she still chose her words with obvious care. "Marcus and Sophia have been testing boundaries lately. They seem to view the household staff as people who exist solely to serve their needs, regardless of how those needs are expressed or what might be happening in our own lives. Sometimes they forget that we're human beings with our own challenges and struggles." David felt his stomach tighten as the implications of Rosa's words began to sink in. His children, the beneficiaries of his life's work and the recipients of every advantage money could provide, had apparently been treating the people who cared for their household with the kind of casual cruelty that spoke to fundamental failures in character development. The realization struck him like a physical blow, challenging everything he had told himself about providing good lives for his family. "What specifically are they doing?" David asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. "I need details, Rosa. I can't fix what I don't understand." Rosa took a deep breath, her composure finally cracking enough to reveal the exhaustion and distress she had been carefully hiding. Yesterday, Sophia accused me of stealing her jewelry when she couldn't find a necklace she had misplaced. She threatened to have me fired without even asking if I had seen it. When she found it in her own drawer an hour later, she didn't apologize or acknowledge that she had falsely accused me of theft. The words hit David with unexpected force, revealing behavior from his daughter that challenged every assumption he had made about her character and values. The casual willingness to destroy someone's livelihood over a misplaced piece of jewelry spoke to a level of callousness that horrified him, particularly because it suggested patterns of thinking he recognized from his own business dealings but had never imagined would extend to personal relationships. "And Marcus?" David asked, though he was beginning to understand that his son's behavior was likely equally troubling. "Marcus has been cruel in different ways," Rosa continued, her voice growing stronger as she finally gave voice to concerns she had apparently been carrying alone. "He makes jokes about my accent, imitates the way I speak when his friends are around, and treats me like I'm invisible unless he needs something. Last week, he threw his dirty laundry on the floor in front of me and said that's what I'm paid for, that I should be grateful he's giving me work to do." The picture Rosa was painting of his children was so different from David's perception of them that he felt disoriented, as if he were learning about strangers who happened to share his last name. The young people she described possessed a casual cruelty and entitled indifference that seemed impossible to reconcile with the children he thought he had raised, yet the specificity of her accounts made denial impossible. "How long has this been going on?" David asked, his voice quieter now as the full scope of the situation began to dawn on him. "It's been getting worse over the past year," Rosa admitted, her relief at finally speaking openly evident in her posture and tone. "I think they've been testing to see how much they can get away with, pushing boundaries to see if anyone will hold them accountable for their behavior. They seem to believe that having money means they can treat other people however they want, that wealth gives them the right to be cruel." The conversation was revealing failures in David's parenting that went far deeper than simple neglect or inattention. His children had apparently learned lessons about power and privilege that he had never intended to teach, developing attitudes toward other people that reflected the worst aspects of unlimited wealth and minimal oversight. The realization that he had inadvertently raised children who could be cruel to good people like Rosa filled him with a shame he hadn't experienced in decades. "Why didn't you tell me about this sooner?" David asked, though even as he spoke the words he suspected he already knew the answer. "With respect, Mr. Harrison, when would I have told you? You leave for work before sunrise and return after dark. The few times we interact, it's about scheduling or household logistics. I've never felt like it was my place to criticize your children's behavior, and I wasn't sure you would believe me if I did." The truth of her observation stung more than any business setback David had ever experienced. He had created a life so focused on external achievement that he had become essentially absent from his own household, leaving his children to be raised by staff members he barely knew and never consulted about anything more significant than meal preferences or scheduling conflicts. His success had been built on delegating responsibility, but he had apparently delegated the most important responsibilities of all. "Rosa, I'm sorry," David said, the words feeling inadequate even as he spoke them. "I had no idea this was happening, but that's not an excuse. I should have known. I should have been paying attention." The apology seemed to surprise Rosa more than any of his previous questions, her carefully maintained professional distance wavering as she processed this unexpected acknowledgement of responsibility from her employer. "Mr. Harrison, I don't want to cause problems for your family. I've been struggling with how to handle the situation. Some days it's hard to come to work knowing that I'll be treated with so little respect." The admission was quietly devastating in its simple honesty. Rosa had been suffering in silence while David remained obliviously focused on business concerns that now seemed trivial by comparison. The woman who maintained his household, who ensured his daily life ran smoothly, who had been an invisible pillar of support for his family, had been enduring cruelty from his own children while he pursued wealth that had apparently come at the cost of their basic humanity. "Things are going to change," David said, his voice carrying the same determination that had driven his business success. "I'm going to address this with Marcus and Sophia immediately." Their behavior is unacceptable, and it stops now." But even as he made the promise, David realized that the conversation with Rosa had revealed problems that went far deeper than simple behavioral corrections could address. His children's attitudes toward other people reflected values and assumptions that had been years in the making, shaped by a lifestyle that had apparently taught them that money could insulate them from the consequences of their actions. Changing those attitudes would require more than parental lectures. It would demand fundamental shifts in how his entire household operated. As Rosa excused herself to complete her evening duties, David remained standing in the foyer, staring at his reflection in the polished marble floor. The image looking back at him was still that of a successful businessman surrounded by the fruits of his labor, but the man in that reflection now seemed like a stranger whose priorities and values had somehow become completely disconnected from anything that mattered. The mansion that had once represented triumph now felt like a prison of his own construction, beautiful and expensive and utterly empty of the human connections that gave life meaning. The sound of Marcus's music drifted down from upstairs, the same casual noise that David had always dismissed as typical teenage behavior. But now he wondered what his son was thinking about while he isolated himself with expensive distractions, whether the young man who bore his name possessed any capacity for empathy or consideration for others. The uncertainty was terrifying in ways that no business crisis had ever been, because it suggested failures that couldn't be corrected with money or strategic planning. Sophia's absence from the house suddenly felt more significant than her usual social activities. David realized he had no idea who his daughter's friends were, what they did together, or what values and attitudes they shared. His financial support had bought her access to exclusive social circles, but he had never bothered to investigate whether those circles were teaching her to be a decent human being or simply reinforcing the entitled attitudes that Rosa had described. The weight of these realizations settled over David like a physical burden as he climbed the stairs toward his bedroom. Every step carried him past family portraits that now seemed to mock his ignorance about the people they depicted, past rooms where his children lived lives he had never bothered to truly understand, past evidence of a household dysfunction that he had been too busy to notice. The success that had once felt like validation now seemed more like a betrayal of everything that should have mattered most. In his bedroom, David sat on the edge of his king-sized bed and stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city lights spread below. Somewhere in that vast urban landscape were millions of people living lives that probably contained more genuine human connection than anything he had experienced in years. His wealth had bought him isolation disguised as luxury, and his children had apparently learned to treat that isolation as a form of superiority over people who couldn't afford to build such elaborate barriers between themselves and the rest of humanity. The conversation with Rosa had revealed the true cost of his success, a price that couldn't be calculated in financial terms but was somehow more devastating than any business loss he had ever experienced. He had gained the whole world and lost something far more valuable, something he was only beginning to understand he had sacrificed without ever realizing what he was giving up. The mansion that surrounded him was filled with beautiful objects and cutting-edge technology, but it was empty of the basic human decency that should have been its foundation. As David prepared for sleep, he found himself thinking about tomorrow's conversations with his children, dreading the revelations that would likely emerge when he finally began paying attention to who they had become under his neglectful oversight. The business skills that had made him wealthy felt completely inadequate for addressing problems rooted in character and values, issues that couldn't be solved through negotiation or strategic planning but required the kind of patient, consistent attention he had never learned to provide. The thought that occurred to him as he finally turned off the lights was both simple and terrifying. He had no idea who his children really were, and he was beginning to suspect that he might not like what he discovered when he finally bothered to find out. The success that had consumed his life had apparently failed in the most important measure of all, producing young people who could be cruel to good people like Rosa without any apparent recognition that such cruelty was wrong. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of reckonings that were years overdue, conversations that should have happened long ago, and confrontations with truths about his family that he had been too busy to acknowledge. The man who had built an empire through careful attention to detail had somehow failed to notice that his own household was falling apart, and the cost of that failure was only beginning to become clear. The morning sun filtered through the silk curtains of David's bedroom as he woke with an unusual heaviness in his chest. His conversation with Rosa from the previous evening had replayed itself in his mind throughout a restless night, each detail becoming more disturbing upon reflection. The casual cruelty she had described from his children seemed impossible to reconcile with the young people he thought he knew, yet the specificity of her accounts made denial futile. David's usual morning routine felt different as he prepared for the day. Every familiar action, from selecting his suit to reviewing his schedule, carried new weight as he contemplated the conversations that lay ahead. His reflection in the bathroom mirror showed the same successful businessman who had stared back at him for years, but the man looking back seemed somehow diminished, forced to confront failures that no amount of wealth could correct. The house felt different too as he made his way downstairs. Hallways that had always seemed elegant now appeared almost sterile in their perfection, beautiful but devoid of warmth. The artwork that lined the walls represented millions of dollars in investment, yet David found himself wondering if his children saw beauty in these pieces or simply viewed them as symbols of their superiority over people who couldn't afford such luxuries. Rosa was already in the kitchen when David arrived, moving through her morning preparations with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized her work for 5 years. She looked up as he entered, her expression carefully neutral despite the unprecedented conversation they had shared the night before. The professional distance she maintained seemed more pronounced now that David understood what it was protecting her from. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice carrying the same careful politeness that never varied regardless of circumstances. "Your coffee is ready, and breakfast will be prepared shortly. Would you prefer to eat in the dining room or the morning room today?" The question was routine, but David found himself studying Rosa's face with new attention, looking for signs of the distress she had finally revealed to him. Her composure was remarkable, he realized, considering the emotional burden she had been carrying while maintaining perfect professional service. The strength required to endure his children's cruelty while continuing to care for their household spoke to character that David was beginning to understand he had never properly valued. "Rosa, I want you to know that I've been thinking about our conversation last night," David said, setting aside the morning paper he usually read during breakfast. "I'm planning to address these issues with Marcus and Sophia today. Their behavior toward you and the other staff is completely unacceptable." She nodded carefully, but David could see uncertainty in her eyes, as if she wasn't entirely convinced that his intervention would produce lasting change. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison. I hope you understand that I didn't want to cause problems for your family. It's been difficult lately." The understatement was heartbreaking in its restraint. David was beginning to comprehend that Rosa's quiet dignity had been masking not just professional disappointment but genuine emotional pain. His children's casual cruelty had been inflicting real harm on someone who had devoted years of her life to caring for their needs, someone who had never done anything to deserve such treatment. Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway as if summoned by David's thoughts, his hair disheveled from sleep and his expensive designer clothes wrinkled from being worn to bed. At 16, he possessed the kind of casual handsomeness that came with good genetics and unlimited access to personal trainers and nutritionists, but his expression carried an entitled indifference that David was now seeing with new clarity. "Rosa, I need you to wash my car today," Marcus announced without any greeting or acknowledgement of his father's presence. "I'm taking it to school, and it's disgusting. Also, my gaming headset is broken, so I need you to order a new one. The expensive kind, not some cheap garbage." The tone of command in his son's voice struck David like a physical blow. There was no please or thank you, no recognition that Rosa was a person deserving of basic courtesy, just the casual assumption that her time and attention existed solely to serve his convenience. David watched Rosa's face carefully and saw the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested this was typical behavior rather than an isolated incident. "Marcus," David said sharply, his business voice cutting through his son's self-absorption. "You will speak to Rosa with respect, and you will ask for her help rather than demanding it." Marcus turned to his father with surprise, clearly unused to being corrected about his interactions with household staff. "What's the big deal? That's what she's paid for, isn't it? I'm not being mean to her." The casual dismissal revealed assumptions about other people that horrified David even more than outright cruelty might have. Marcus genuinely didn't understand that his behavior was problematic, apparently believing that employing someone gave him the right to treat them as less than human. The wealth that David had worked to provide for his family had somehow taught his son that money created hierarchies that justified fundamental disrespect. "The fact that Rosa works for our family doesn't mean you can treat her like property," David said, his voice rising with anger that surprised both father and son. "She's a human being who deserves courtesy and consideration, regardless of her employment status. You will apologize to her right now, and you will change how you speak to everyone who works in this house." Marcus's expression shifted from surprise to resentment, the look of someone whose comfortable assumptions were being challenged for the first time. "Fine, whatever. Sorry, Rosa. Can I go now? I'm going to be late for school." The apology was so obviously insincere that it actually made things worse, demonstrating that Marcus viewed courtesy as a meaningless ritual to be performed when forced rather than a genuine expression of respect for another person. David realized that correcting this behavior would require much more than simple parental commands. His son's attitudes reflected years of conditioning that would need to be completely restructured. "No, you cannot go," David said firmly. "You and I are going to have a serious conversation about how you treat the people who work in this house. And you're going to start by giving Rosa a real apology, one that acknowledges how your behavior has been affecting her." The standoff that followed revealed the depth of dysfunction in David's household. Marcus clearly expected his father to back down, to prioritize his school schedule over what he obviously viewed as an unnecessary confrontation about trivial matters. Rosa stood frozen between them, uncomfortable with being the center of a family conflict she had never intended to cause. David felt the weight of years of neglected parenting settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Sophia's arrival in the kitchen broke the tense silence, her appearance perfectly coordinated despite the early hour. At 14, she already possessed the calculating gaze of someone who had learned to evaluate every situation for potential advantage, her beauty combined with an intelligence that seemed to be focused primarily on manipulation rather than genuine accomplishment. She took in the scene with the kind of cool assessment that made David wonder what other dynamics in his household he had been missing. "What's going on?" Sophia asked, her tone suggesting mild curiosity rather than concern. "Why does everyone look so serious?" "Your father is upset because I told Marcus to ask Rosa nicely instead of just ordering her around," Marcus said, his voice carrying the whine of someone who felt unfairly persecuted. "Apparently that makes me some kind of terrible person." Sophia's laugh was light and dismissive, the sound of someone who found the entire situation absurd. "Dad, you can't seriously be upset about that. Rosa doesn't mind, do you, Rosa? That's just how we talk to the staff. It's not like we're being cruel or anything." The casual assumption that Rosa would agree with her assessment revealed the same fundamental misunderstanding that plagued Marcus's behavior. Neither of his children seemed capable of recognizing that their employee might have feelings or opinions that differed from their own convenience, that politeness and respect were obligations rather than optional courtesies to be extended only when it suited them. "Actually, I do mind," Rosa said quietly, her voice carrying more strength than David had ever heard from her before. "I mind being spoken to as if I'm not a person. I mind being treated like furniture that exists only for your convenience. I mind having my work dismissed as unimportant and my feelings ignored completely." The silence that followed Rosa's words was deafening. Neither Marcus nor Sophia had ever heard their employee speak with such directness, and their shocked expressions revealed how completely they had misunderstood her willingness to tolerate their behavior. David felt a surge of pride in Rosa's courage, mixed with shame that it had taken so long for anyone in his family to hear her voice. "Rosa has every right to be treated with dignity and respect," David said, his voice carrying the authority he usually reserved for board meetings. "The fact that she works for us doesn't make her less than us, and it certainly doesn't give either of you the right to be cruel or dismissive. Your behavior toward her and the other staff stops immediately." "Cruel?" Sophia's voice rose with indignation. "We're not cruel. We just know how to maintain appropriate boundaries between employers and employees. You can't run a household if you treat the staff like they're your friends." The sophistication of Sophia's argument was almost more disturbing than Marcus's simple entitlement. She had apparently developed a philosophical framework to justify cruelty, wrapping basic disrespect in language about professional boundaries and household management. The intelligence that should have made her more empathetic had instead been channeled into rationalizing behavior that would have been unacceptable in any civilized context. There's a difference between maintaining professional boundaries and treating people like they don't matter, David replied, struggling to control his growing anger. Rosa has been taking care of this family for 5 years. She's never done anything but excellent work, and she's never been anything but respectful to all of us. The way you've been treating her is shameful. The conversation was revealing layers of dysfunction that David had never suspected existed in his own household. His children's behavior reflected not just personal failings but systemic problems with how wealth and privilege had been handled in their family. The values he thought he had been teaching through his example of hard work and success had somehow been transformed into lessons about superiority and entitlement that justified cruelty toward anyone who couldn't match their economic status. "I don't understand what we're supposed to have done wrong," Marcus said, his defensive tone suggesting he genuinely couldn't comprehend the problem. "We pay her salary. We give her a place to live. We're not asking her to do anything that isn't part of her job. If she doesn't like it, she can quit." The casual suggestion that Rosa should simply leave if she didn't enjoy being mistreated revealed the depth of Marcus's disconnection from economic reality. To him, employment was apparently a luxury that people should be grateful for regardless of how they were treated, rather than a relationship that carried mutual obligations and basic human decency. His wealth had insulated him from understanding that most people couldn't simply walk away from jobs they needed to survive. "Rosa can't just quit because you treat her badly," David explained, his patience wearing thin with his son's willful ignorance. "She has responsibilities and obligations that require her income. Your behavior toward her isn't just cruel, it's an abuse of the power that comes with being her employer. You're taking advantage of her economic dependence to treat her in ways you would never treat someone who had other options." The economic realities that David was attempting to explain seemed to perplex both of his children, who had never been forced to consider the practical constraints that governed other people's lives. Their wealth had created such complete insulation from financial concerns that they appeared genuinely unable to understand why someone would tolerate treatment they found objectionable. The empathy that should have developed naturally had been stunted by privilege that eliminated any need to consider other people's perspectives. "But that's just how employment works," Sophia argued, her tone suggesting she was explaining something obvious to someone who was being deliberately obtuse. "People work for money, and employers decide how that work gets done. If Rosa doesn't like our family's standards, she should find a different job with different standards." The circular logic of Sophia's argument was maddening in its internal consistency and complete moral blindness. She had constructed a worldview that transformed cruelty into legitimate business practice, using economic relationships to justify behavior that would have been obviously wrong in any other context. Her intelligence was working against basic human decency, creating elaborate rationalizations for simple failures of character. David realized that correcting his children's behavior would require more than explaining why it was wrong. He would need to completely rebuild their understanding of how people should treat each other. The attitudes they had developed weren't just bad habits that could be modified through discipline, but fundamental beliefs about human worth and dignity that had been shaped by years of unchallenged privilege. "You're both missing the point entirely," David said, his voice carrying exhaustion as well as anger. "This isn't about employment standards or professional boundaries. This is about basic human decency. Rosa isn't just an employee, she's a person who deserves to be treated with kindness and respect regardless of her job or economic status." The concept of treating employees with kindness appeared to be genuinely foreign to both Marcus and Sophia, who exchanged glances that suggested their father had suddenly begun speaking a language they didn't understand. Their confusion was heartbreaking evidence of how completely their upbringing had failed to instill basic moral principles that should have been foundational to their character development. Rosa had remained silent during this family confrontation, her discomfort with being the center of such attention evident in her posture and expression. David could see that she was struggling between gratitude for his defense and concern about the long-term consequences of this conflict for her position in the household. Her silence spoke to years of experience with wealthy families whose internal dynamics could shift unpredictably, affecting employees who had no control over their circumstances. "Rosa, I want you to know that your job is secure regardless of how this conversation resolves," David said, addressing her directly while keeping his eyes on his children. "You've done nothing wrong, and you won't be penalized for speaking honestly about how you've been treated. My children need to learn that actions have consequences, and those consequences include being held accountable for hurting people who have done nothing to deserve it." The reassurance seemed to give Rosa permission to speak more freely, though she still chose her words with obvious care. "Mr. Harrison, I appreciate your support, but I want you to understand that this isn't just about me. The way Marcus and Sophia treat all the staff reflects attitudes that go deeper than simple rudeness. They seem to believe that having money makes them better than people who don't, that wealth justifies treating others as if they don't matter." Her observation cut to the heart of the problem David was beginning to understand. His children hadn't simply learned bad manners, they had absorbed a complete worldview that ranked human worth according to economic status. The privilege he had worked to provide for them had become a poison that was corrupting their basic humanity, transforming advantages into excuses for cruelty. "That's not what we think," Sophia protested, but her tone lacked conviction. "We just understand how the world works. People have different roles and responsibilities, and some jobs are more important than others. That doesn't mean we think we're better people, just that we have different positions in society." The sophistication of Sophia's rationalization was almost worse than simple cruelty because it revealed systematic thinking about human hierarchy that justified endless variations of mistreatment. She had constructed an intellectual framework that transformed social and economic inequality into natural law, using abstract concepts about roles and positions to avoid confronting the concrete harm her behavior was causing to real people. "Your position in society doesn't give you the right to be cruel," David said firmly. "Having money doesn't make you more important than Rosa or anyone else who works in this house. Success and wealth are advantages, not virtues, and they certainly don't justify treating other people badly." The distinction between advantages and virtues appeared to be completely lost on both of his children, who seemed unable to separate their material circumstances from their personal worth. Their identity had become so thoroughly merged with their economic status that they couldn't imagine measuring themselves or others by different standards. The wealth that should have provided security and opportunity had instead become a barrier to developing genuine character. Marcus's frustration with the entire conversation was evident in his body language and tone as he attempted to redirect the discussion back to practical matters. "Can we please just move on from this? I'm going to be late for school, and I still need Rosa to wash my car. Whether I ask nicely or not, it's still her job to do what I need her to do." The casual dismissal of everything that had been discussed revealed how little impact David's intervention had made on his son's fundamental attitudes. Marcus was willing to perform politeness when forced, but he clearly didn't understand or accept the underlying principles that made such performance meaningful. His compliance would be temporary and superficial, lasting only as long as external pressure was maintained. "No, we cannot move on from this," David replied, his voice hardening with resolve. "Your car will not be washed today, and Rosa will not be ordering you a new gaming headset. You're going to spend today thinking about how your behavior affects other people, and you're going to continue thinking about it until you develop some genuine understanding of why it's wrong." The consequences David was imposing were modest compared to the scale of the problem he was addressing, but Marcus's shocked reaction suggested that even these minor restrictions represented a completely unprecedented challenge to his expectations. He had apparently never been forced to consider that his behavior might result in tangible costs to himself, never been required to connect his treatment of others to his own comfort and convenience. "You can't be serious," Marcus said, his voice rising with disbelief. "You're going to punish me for asking an employee to do her job? That's completely unfair." The characterization of his demands as simply asking Rosa to do her job revealed how completely Marcus misunderstood both the nature of employment and the basic requirements of human decency. In his mind, paying someone's salary apparently purchased unlimited access to their time and labor without any corresponding obligation to treat them with respect or consideration. The transactional view of human relationships that governed his thinking eliminated any space for empathy or moral responsibility. Sophia's approach to the crisis was more sophisticated than her brother's direct confrontation, but equally problematic in its implications. "Dad, I think you're overreacting to this situation. Rosa is a professional employee who understood the requirements of her position when she accepted the job. If she's unhappy with how she's being treated, the appropriate response is to discuss it professionally, not to create drama that disrupts the entire household." The attempt to reframe Rosa's honest expression of distress as unprofessional drama revealed the same pattern of thinking that characterized all of Sophia's rationalizations. She was systematically inverting moral relationships, making the victim responsible for addressing problems created by their mistreatment while absolving the perpetrators of any obligation to examine their own behavior. The intellectual sophistication she brought to this process made it more rather than less disturbing. "Rosa's response to your behavior has been more professional than either of you deserve," David said, his respect for his employee's restraint growing with each exchange. "She's endured months of mistreatment without complaint, maintained excellent work standards despite being treated badly, and only spoke honestly about the situation when I specifically asked her to do so. The drama you're referring to is entirely the result of your own actions." The concept that their behavior was the source of household disruption seemed genuinely surprising to both Marcus and Sophia, who had apparently assumed that problems would be resolved by others adapting to their preferences rather than by any changes on their part. Their shock at being held responsible for consequences revealed how completely they had been insulated from accountability for their actions toward people they viewed as subordinates. David was beginning to understand that the conversation he had planned as a simple correction of bad behavior was actually the beginning of a much larger process of moral education that should have been completed years earlier. His children's attitudes weren't just problematic, they were fundamentally corrupt, reflecting a complete failure to develop basic human empathy and consideration for others. The wealth he had provided had somehow transformed advantages into excuses for cruelty. The kitchen fell silent as the full scope of the family's dysfunction became clear to everyone present. Rosa stood quietly beside the counter, her dignity intact despite months of mistreatment, representing values of service and respect that neither Marcus nor Sophia seemed capable of recognizing or appreciating. David felt the weight of years of neglectful parenting settling on him like a crushing burden, the understanding that his success had come at costs he was only beginning to calculate. "Both of you will spend the day thinking about this conversation," David announced, his voice carrying the finality of a business decision. "Marcus, you'll take the bus to school and explain to your friends why your car isn't available. Sophia, you'll cancel your shopping plans and spend the afternoon helping Rosa with household tasks, not as punishment but as education about the work that goes into maintaining the life you take for granted." The consequences he was imposing felt inadequate to address problems that had been years in the making, but they represented a beginning of accountability that had been completely absent from his children's lives. Their shocked protests revealed how unprecedented these requirements were, how completely they had been allowed to believe that their comfort and convenience were the only factors that mattered in family decisions. "This is ridiculous," Marcus said, his voice cracking with adolescent indignation. "You're destroying my entire day because some employee complained about perfectly normal interactions. None of my friends' parents would ever side with staff over their own children." The comparison to other wealthy families suggested that the problems David was discovering might not be unique to his household, that his children's attitudes reflected broader patterns of privilege and entitlement that were systematically corrupting young people across their entire social class. The possibility that Marcus was right about other parents' priorities was deeply disturbing, suggesting institutional failures that extended far beyond individual family dynamics. "I'm not siding with staff over you," David replied, struggling to control his growing frustration with his son's inability to understand basic moral concepts. "I'm trying to teach you that treating people badly is wrong regardless of their relationship to you or their economic status. If other parents don't care about teaching their children basic human decency, that's their failure, not a standard I intend to follow." The moral clarity that David was attempting to establish seemed to confuse rather than convince his children, who had apparently never been asked to consider ethical principles that couldn't be reduced to personal advantage or family loyalty. Their education had apparently prepared them for economic competition but completely neglected the character development that would make such competition compatible with basic humanity. Rosa's quiet voice broke through the family conflict with an observation that revealed the true scope of the crisis. "Mr. Harrison, if I may say something. The problem isn't just how Marcus and Sophia treat the staff. The problem is that they don't understand that other people are real. They've been raised to see anyone who isn't part of their social class as characters in a movie rather than actual human beings with feelings and needs and dignity." Her insight was devastating in its accuracy and implications. David realized that his children's cruelty wasn't simple meanness but a fundamental failure of imagination and empathy that made them incapable of recognizing the full humanity of people they viewed as different from themselves. The wealth that should have expanded their opportunities had instead contracted their moral universe to include only people who shared their economic status. The realization that Rosa understood his children better than he did was humbling and frightening. She had been observing their development with the clear eyes of someone who was affected by their behavior, while he had been looking at them through the distorting lens of parental love and projection. Her perspective revealed failures in their character that he had been too busy or too biased to recognize. "I think Rosa is exactly right," David said, his voice heavy with acknowledgement of how completely he had failed as a parent. "You've both learned to see yourselves as more real, more important, more deserving of consideration than people who don't share your advantages. That's not just cruel, it's a form of moral blindness that will corrupt everything else in your lives." The diagnosis he was offering seemed to penetrate his children's defensive rationalizations in ways that his earlier arguments had not. For the first time in the conversation, both Marcus and Sophia appeared genuinely uncomfortable rather than simply resentful, as if they were beginning to recognize something disturbing in their own attitudes that they had never examined before. "But we're not bad people," Sophia said, her voice smaller than it had been throughout the confrontation. "We don't try to hurt anyone. We just treat people the way everyone in our position treats people. It's not like we invented these social rules." The plea for understanding revealed a glimmer of self-awareness that gave David hope for the first time since the conversation began. Sophia was beginning to question assumptions she had never examined, to recognize that social norms within her privileged circle might not represent universal standards of appropriate behavior. The defense that everyone behaved the same way was weakening as she started to consider whether that uniformity might itself be problematic. "The fact that other wealthy people treat service workers badly doesn't make it right," David explained, his voice gentler now that he sensed some genuine engagement from his daughter. "Social rules that justify cruelty toward people who can't fight back aren't rules worth following. You're smart enough to recognize wrong behavior when you see it, regardless of whether other people are doing the same thing." The appeal to Sophia's intelligence seemed to reach her in ways that moral arguments alone had not. She was beginning to use her analytical abilities to examine her own behavior rather than simply to rationalize it, a shift that suggested the possibility of genuine change rather than mere compliance. The recognition that her intelligence could be used for self-examination rather than self-justification represented a crucial development in her moral thinking. Marcus remained more resistant to self-examination, his body language and expression suggesting resentment rather than reflection. "I still don't see what the big deal is. We're not beating anyone or calling them names. We just expect them to do their jobs without making a big production out of it. If that's cruel, then basically every employer in the world is cruel." The comparison to employer-employee relationships more broadly revealed Marcus's inability to distinguish between legitimate workplace expectations and personal mistreatment. His understanding of authority was apparently based on power rather than responsibility, treating employment relationships as licenses for domination rather than arrangements requiring mutual respect and consideration. "There's a difference between expecting professional competence and treating people as if they don't deserve basic courtesy," David replied, recognizing that his son's resistance to understanding was more deeply rooted than simple stubbornness. Good employers understand that respect and kindness actually improve work performance, while cruelty and dismissiveness create resentment and reduce quality. Even from a purely practical perspective, your behavior toward Rosa has been counterproductive. The practical argument seemed to register with Marcus in ways that moral appeals had not, suggesting that his thinking was so thoroughly transactional that ethical considerations required translation into cost-benefit terms to be comprehensible. The necessity of such translation was itself evidence of how completely his character development had been corrupted by wealth and privilege. David was beginning to understand that reforming his children's behavior would require not just immediate consequences but systematic re-education about human relationships and moral responsibility. The attitudes they had developed were so fundamental to their identity that changing them would essentially require rebuilding their personalities from the ground up, a process that would take years rather than days or weeks. The kitchen had become the site of a family crisis that went far deeper than simple behavioral correction. 3 generations were represented in the room, but only Rosa seemed to possess the moral clarity and human decency that should have guided all their interactions. The wealth that was supposed to provide advantages for David's children had instead become a barrier to developing the character traits that would make those advantages meaningful rather than corrupting. As the immediate confrontation began to wind down, David realized that this conversation was only the beginning of a much longer process of addressing problems that had been years in the making. His children's attitudes toward Rosa and the other staff were symptoms of deeper failures in their moral education that would require sustained attention and effort to correct. The success that had consumed his life had apparently failed in its most important objective, producing young people who were wealthy but fundamentally damaged in their capacity for human relationship. The silence that settled over the kitchen carried the weight of revelations that would reshape how David understood his family and his responsibilities as a father. The conversation with Rosa had opened a door to recognizing problems he had never suspected existed, but addressing those problems would require changes that extended far beyond simple behavioral modifications. His children needed to learn not just how to treat employees respectfully, but how to recognize the full humanity of everyone they encountered, regardless of social or economic status. Rosa's quiet dignity throughout the confrontation had provided a model of how people should behave toward each other, but David wasn't sure his children possessed the moral foundation necessary to recognize or emulate such examples. The wealth that should have expanded their capacity for generosity and service had instead contracted their empathy to include only people who shared their advantages. Reversing that contraction would require more than parental intervention. It would demand fundamental changes in how their entire household operated and what values it embodied in daily practice. The morning that had begun with routine expectations had transformed into a reckoning with failures that threatened everything David thought he understood about his family and his success. The house around them remained the same magnificent structure it had always been, but the relationships within it had been revealed as hollow and corrupted by privilege that had never been balanced with responsibility or service. The wealth that was supposed to provide security and opportunity had instead become a poison that was destroying the very relationships that should have made such advantages meaningful. As David looked around the kitchen at his children and his employee, he realized that the most important work of his life was only beginning. The empire he had built in the business world meant nothing if he couldn't find ways to rebuild the moral foundations of his own household. The success that had consumed his attention for decades would ultimately be meaningless if it left him with children who were incapable of basic human decency toward people who had devoted their lives to caring for their needs. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across David's study as he sat behind his mahogany desk, staring at quarterly reports that no longer held his attention. The morning's confrontation with his children had left him emotionally drained and questioning everything he thought he understood about his family. Marcus had stormed out to catch the bus, his face flushed with resentment, while Sophia had retreated to her room with the sullen defiance of someone who felt unjustly persecuted. David's attempts to concentrate on business matters felt increasingly futile as his mind kept returning to Rosa's quiet dignity and his children's casual cruelty. The woman who had maintained his household with such devotion deserved better than the treatment she had been receiving, yet his own negligence as a father had created the conditions that made such treatment possible. The weight of this realization sat heavy in his chest like a stone he couldn't dislodge. A soft knock on his study door interrupted his troubled thoughts. David looked up to see Rosa standing in the doorway, her expression hesitant but determined. She held a folded piece of paper in her hands, her fingers trembling slightly as she approached his desk. Something in her demeanor immediately set off alarms in David's mind, a sense that whatever she was about to share would be even more devastating than the revelations of the morning. "Mr. Harrison, I need to give you something," Rosa said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wrote this last night after we spoke. I wasn't sure if I should show it to you, but after what happened this morning, I think you need to understand how serious things have become." She placed the folded paper on his desk with the careful precision of someone handling something fragile and dangerous. Her hands shook as she stepped back, and David could see tears forming in her eyes despite her attempts to maintain composure. The formality of her gesture suggested that whatever she was sharing represented more than simple communication. It felt like a confession or perhaps a goodbye. David's hands trembled as he unfolded the paper, recognizing Rosa's careful handwriting immediately. The words that met his eyes struck him like physical blows, each sentence revealing depths of pain and desperation he had never imagined existed within his own household. What he was reading was unmistakably a suicide note, written by a woman who had been pushed beyond her breaking point by circumstances he had unknowingly created and perpetuated. "I cannot continue living this way," the note began in Rosa's precise script. "Every morning I wake up knowing I will be treated like dirt by children I have cared for as if they were my own. Every day I smile and clean and cook while being told I am worthless, that I should be grateful for crumbs of basic human decency. I have endured this because I needed the job, because I have family depending on me, but I cannot sacrifice my soul for money anymore." David felt his breath catch in his throat as the full implications of what he was reading began to sink in. Rosa hadn't simply been enduring casual rudeness from his children, she had been systematically degraded and dehumanized to the point where death seemed preferable to continuing her employment in his household. The success he had built, the comfortable life he had created for his family, had become a form of torture for someone who had devoted years of her life to serving their needs. "Marcus told me yesterday that people like me exist to make people like him comfortable," the letter continued. "He said I should remember my place and stop acting like I deserve respect." Sophia laughed when I accidentally broke a plate while serving her lunch, and she said it proved that poor people can't be trusted with nice things. "They look at me like I'm an animal that learned to walk upright, something amusing but ultimately disposable." The specific details Rosa had recorded struck David with the force of personal betrayal. These weren't general complaints about rude behavior, they were documented instances of systematic cruelty that revealed his children's attitudes toward other human beings. The casual viciousness she described went far beyond anything he had imagined possible from young people he had raised, suggesting depths of moral corruption that horrified him. "I lie awake at night thinking about my sister's children back in Guatemala, wondering if the money I send them is worth the price I pay in dignity and self-respect," Rosa had written. "I tell myself that their education and food matter more than my feelings, but I can feel myself disappearing a little more each day. I am becoming invisible even to myself, a shadow that exists only to serve people who hate everything I am." David's vision blurred as tears began flowing down his cheeks. The woman who had maintained his household with such quiet competence had been slowly dying inside, sacrificing not just her comfort but her very sense of self-worth to provide for family members who would never know the true cost of her devotion. The money he paid her, which had seemed generous by industry standards, could never compensate for the psychological damage his children had been inflicting. "I keep thinking about my mother's words before she died," the letter continued. "She told me that no job is worth losing your soul, that God sees how we treat each other and judges us accordingly. I have been compromising my mother's teachings every day I stay in this house, pretending that money can justify being treated worse than an animal. I cannot face her in heaven knowing I sold my dignity for a salary." The religious dimension of Rosa's suffering added another layer of tragedy to David's understanding of what had been happening under his own roof. Her faith, which should have provided comfort and strength, had instead become a source of additional torment as she struggled to reconcile her spiritual beliefs with the practical necessities of survival. His children's behavior hadn't just hurt her feelings, it had created a crisis of conscience that was tearing apart her fundamental sense of identity and purpose. "Mr. Harrison, I know you are a good man who works hard for his family," Rosa had written. "You have always been kind to me in the few moments when we interact. But your children have learned to see people like me as less than human, and I cannot continue to enable their cruelty by accepting it silently. If I cannot find another way to support my sister's children, I would rather join my family in heaven than continue to have my humanity stripped away piece by piece. The final paragraphs of the letter outline Rosa's plans with the same methodical care she brought to all her responsibilities. She had researched methods that would be quick and painless, had written letters to her family members in Guatemala explaining her decision, and had even organized her personal belongings so they could be easily disposed of after her death. The systematic approach she had taken to planning her suicide reflected the same conscientiousness that had made her such an excellent employee, transformed into a tool for ending the life that employment had made unbearable. David's hands shook violently as he finished reading the letter, his successful businessman's composure completely shattered by the revelation of what his family had unknowingly been driving toward. The woman who had cared for his household with such devotion had been planning to kill herself rather than continue enduring treatment that had made her existence feel worthless. The casual cruelty he had dismissed as typical teenage behavior had actually been a form of psychological torture that was pushing another human being toward death. "Rosa," David said, his voice breaking as he looked up at her through his tears. "When did you write this? Were you really planning to?" He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the terrible possibility that his neglect as a father might have cost an innocent woman her life. "Last night, after we talked," Rosa replied, her own tears flowing freely now that the secret was finally shared. "I had been thinking about it for weeks, but your children's behavior yesterday pushed me over the edge. When Marcus told me I should be grateful for abuse because at least I was getting paid for it, something inside me just broke. I couldn't see any way to continue living like this." The timeline Rosa was describing meant that David's intervention had come just hours before she might have acted on her desperate plans. The conversation that had seemed like a routine household management issue had actually been a life-or-death crisis that he had been completely unaware of until this moment. His children's cruelty hadn't just been morally wrong, it had been literally deadly in its psychological impact on someone who had nowhere else to turn. "But why didn't you come to me sooner?" David asked, though even as he spoke the words he recognized how naive the question was. "Why did you let things get to this point before saying anything?" Rosa's smile was sad and understanding, the expression of someone who had long ago learned not to expect rescue from situations that seemed hopeless. "Mr. Harrison, with respect, when would I have come to you? You leave before sunrise and return after dark. The few times we speak, it's about scheduling or meal preferences. I never felt like it was my place to criticize your children, and I wasn't sure you would believe me if I did." Her gentle explanation highlighted another dimension of David's failure as both an employer and a father. His focus on business success had made him essentially absent from his own household, leaving Rosa to navigate increasingly dangerous situations with no support or protection from the person who should have been ensuring her safety and dignity. His children had been free to escalate their cruelty because they knew there was no authority figure paying attention to their behavior. "You were going to kill yourself because of how my children treated you," David said, the words feeling surreal even as he spoke them. "My success, my wealth, my beautiful house, all of it was built on the suffering of someone who never did anything but try to help my family. How did I let things get so wrong?" The question hung in the air between them, carrying the weight of years of accumulated failures and missed opportunities for intervention. David's empire of business success suddenly seemed built on foundations of moral quicksand, impressive from a distance but fundamentally unstable when subjected to serious examination. The values he thought he had been teaching his children through his example of hard work and achievement had somehow been transformed into lessons about domination and cruelty that were literally driving people to despair. Rosa moved closer to his desk, her expression filled with compassion despite everything she had endured. "Mr. Harrison, you're not a bad person. You've been focused on providing for your family, which is admirable. But wealth without wisdom, success without empathy, it creates monsters out of children who could have been beautiful human beings. Your children aren't evil, but they've learned to see the world in ways that make evil feel natural and justified." Her ability to maintain empathy for the people who had driven her to contemplate suicide was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of her character. Even in her deepest despair, Rosa had retained enough humanity to recognize the complex factors that had created the crisis, to distinguish between personal malice and systematic failures that had corrupted young people who might have developed differently under other circumstances. "I'm going to fix this," David said, his voice carrying the same determination that had built his business empire. "I don't care what it takes or how long it requires. Marcus and Sophia are going to learn to treat you and everyone else with the respect and kindness you deserve. This family is going to change, starting right now." The promise felt both necessary and inadequate given the scope of the problems that needed addressing. David's children hadn't simply learned bad habits that could be corrected through discipline, they had absorbed fundamental attitudes about human worth and dignity that would require years of systematic re-education to modify. The transformation he was envisioning would demand not just changes in behavior but complete reconstruction of their moral foundations. Rosa nodded gratefully, though her expression suggested cautious hope rather than complete confidence in his ability to reform attitudes that had been years in the making. "I appreciate that, Mr. Harrison. But change like this takes time, and I'm not sure I can continue to be the target of their learning process. Some damage is very hard to heal, and I don't know if I'm strong enough to endure more while they figure out how to be decent people." Her honesty about the limitations of her resilience forced David to confront the practical realities of the situation he was attempting to address. Rosa had already been pushed to the breaking point by his children's behavior. Expecting her to remain in place while he attempted to reform them would essentially be asking her to risk her psychological survival for the convenience of his family's moral education. The unfairness of such an expectation was obvious once he allowed himself to see it clearly. "You don't have to stay if you don't feel safe here," David said, though the words cost him significant effort to speak. "I'll provide excellent references and severance pay that will give you time to find a position with a family that will appreciate your qualities. Your well-being matters more than our convenience, and you shouldn't have to sacrifice your health for our family's problems." The offer of freedom seemed to lift a tremendous weight from Rosa's shoulders, her posture straightening as she contemplated possibilities beyond the daily endurance that had defined her recent existence. The option to leave without economic devastation restored a sense of agency that David's children had been systematically destroying through their treatment of her as someone who had no choices or alternatives. "Thank you for understanding," Rosa said, her voice carrying relief mixed with lingering sadness. "I have loved caring for your family, but I cannot continue to pay such a high price for employment. My mother raised me to believe that all work has dignity, but what I've been experiencing here isn't work anymore, it's systematic humiliation that's destroying who I am as a person." David felt ashamed that it had taken a suicide note for him to recognize what should have been obvious much earlier. Rosa's devotion to his family had been repaid with cruelty that had nearly cost her life, and his success in business had completely blinded him to the human costs of his domestic arrangements. The wealth that was supposed to make life better for everyone had instead become a tool for inflicting suffering on someone whose only crime was needing employment. "Before you make any final decisions about leaving," David said carefully, "I want you to see that real changes are possible. Give me 1 week to demonstrate that this family can learn to treat you with the respect you've always deserved. If you don't see genuine improvement by then, I'll help you transition to a situation where your dignity and well-being will be protected." The proposal seemed fair to both of them, offering Rosa hope for improvement while acknowledging her right to prioritize her own psychological safety over his family's convenience. David understood that he was essentially asking for an opportunity to prove that the people who had driven her to contemplate suicide could transform themselves into decent human beings, a request that required tremendous faith in human potential for change. 1 week, Rosa agreed, her voice stronger than it had been throughout their conversation. "But Mr. Harrison, the changes have to be real, not just performances to convince me to stay. Your children need to understand that treating people badly is wrong because it hurts them, not just because it might cost them their household staff." Her stipulation went to the heart of the moral education challenge David was facing. Surface compliance with politeness requirements wouldn't address the fundamental attitudes that had created the crisis. His children needed to develop genuine empathy and respect for other people's humanity. Such character development couldn't be forced or faked, it required authentic transformation of how they understood themselves and their relationships with others. The week that followed became the most intensive period of moral education David had ever attempted, as he worked to undo years of damage caused by his neglectful parenting and his children's unchallenged privilege. Marcus and Sophia initially resisted his efforts to reshape their attitudes, viewing the entire process as unfair punishment for behavior they still didn't fully understand was problematic. Their resistance forced David to confront just how deeply their corruption had penetrated, how completely their wealth had insulated them from developing basic human empathy. But gradually, through sustained attention and consequences that finally connected their behavior to personal costs, both children began to recognize the harm they had been causing. The transformation wasn't easy or immediate. It required daily conversations, consistent enforcement of new expectations, and most importantly, David's own willingness to model the respect and kindness he was demanding from them. The process forced him to examine his own attitudes towards service workers and economic inequality, recognizing ways that his business success had desensitized him to other people's struggles. By the end of the week, Marcus had begun speaking to Rosa with genuine courtesy, asking about her family and expressing interest in her life beyond her work responsibilities. Sophia, whose intelligence had previously been channeled into rationalization, started using her analytical abilities to examine her own behavior and its effects on others. The changes weren't complete. Years of conditioning couldn't be undone in 7 days, but they represented genuine beginnings of the moral development that should have happened much earlier. Rosa chose to stay, not because the problems had been fully resolved but because she could see authentic efforts toward change that gave her hope for continued improvement. David established new household policies that protected all staff from mistreatment, created regular opportunities for family discussions about respect and dignity, and most importantly, maintained his own commitment to being present in his children's moral education rather than delegating such responsibilities to others. The experience transformed David's understanding of success and wealth, teaching him that material achievement without human decency was actually a form of failure that corrupted everything it touched. His children's capacity for cruelty had been a direct result of advantages that hadn't been balanced with responsibilities, privileges that had never been connected to service or empathy for others. The suicide note that could have ended Rosa's life instead became the catalyst for rebuilding his family's moral foundations on principles of respect and human dignity that gave meaning to their material advantages. Years later, David would look back on Rosa's suicide note as the document that saved not just her life but his entire family's capacity for genuine human connection. The crisis that could have destroyed everything instead became the foundation for relationships based on mutual respect rather than economic hierarchy, teaching his children that true wealth lay not in what they owned but in how they treated others who had less. The note that had documented despair became the beginning of hope, transforming a household built on privilege into a family committed to using their advantages in service of human dignity for everyone whose lives they touched. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.